So every training example is going to have different input and thus a different gradient. And another way of saying that is that its contribution to the error, to the overall error, is going to be different from every other example. So what's going on is that we typically gather up all of the gradients for every single training example, and then we average over them. So as we've defined it, our update equations, average gradients. Over all training examples. Does anyone see a potential problem here? Could this be problematic? And I'll tell you right now, there are problems, but there are also benefits as well. Like, as with everything in machine learning, nothing is straightforward. Nothing is definite. But are there potential problems with averaging all of these gradients together when it comes to, like, learning? Why might this be a bad thing? I can tell you the reasons why it might be a good thing while I wait for you to kind of come up with an answer to why it might be bad. The reason why this might be good is because our updates will be smoother. They'll be less variant. And so it means our weights, because remember, we just have one set of weights, are likely to kind of move gently in one direction. However, why might this be bad? The reason this might be bad is that, well, as with overcorrection for some parameters, not quite overcorrection, but more like ignoring some parameters. So remember, every time you take an average anywhere, you are losing information. You are choosing to throw away some amount of information. And you're doing that so that, again, to reduce variance normally. So the downside with averaging, or potential downside with averaging over all training examples is that you're only going to do one weight update, and that weight update might not accurately reflect the error in each individual example. So you may lose information doing this. However, the benefit is that you usually get a smoother change in parameters over time. So this method of doing things is called a full batch update. What you do is you take in every example in your training set. And note, because you see every example in your training set, this would technically constitute one epoch. But then you calculate up all those gradients, you average them, and then you do your weight update. But that's not the only way to do things. So this is the full batch. This is the full batch update. Put a little arrow up to there. So there are two other ways that you can do things. I'll go to the other extreme first. And it all has to do with how you define M, really. So on one extreme, we look at every single example in our training set and we average over these gradients. The alternative is we just look at one example and we do a weight update based on that one example. And that's called stochastic gradient descent. This is what I've heard it referred to as. And so to stochastic gradient descent, you look at one example, then update weights. So here, you look at a single example, calculate its gradient, boom, update weights. Thus, if you have m elements in your training set, you would actually need to do m weight updates, one for each example, before you got through an entire epoch, if you were using epochs as a stopping criteria. Now, what's the downside with this? Well, the downside is actually kind of the opposite of the downsides with a full batch update. In that, how heavily do results depend on the order in which you see the examples? I mean, they depend pretty well, actually, no, it depends. It depends. If you're doing a full batch update, it doesn't matter at all. Because remember, you're going to look at everything in your training set before you do a single weight update. So the order doesn't matter, because it's all going to get averaged out anyway. If you're doing stochastic gradient descent and you're looking at a single example and then doing an update, it's going to matter a lot. Which is why you usually randomize the order that you look at things using stochastic gradient descent. But yeah, the order would matter a lot because, for example, if you see a very, like an example first that has a lot of error, that's going to drag your weights in one direction by a large amount. And so that could have large effects on your overall learning than if you started with something maybe a little smaller, with smaller error. So yeah, like that, it can have a large effect. Why do we need to use stochastic gradient descent and the linear regression? We already know how to fit the model. Ah, yes! Somebody always asks this. So there are a few reasons. So, the question is, why use gradient descent when we know how to analytically assess the solution? So the answer is complicated. Again, there's not a clear one is better than the other. So this is another tool that you put in your toolbox for handling regression. But there are a few cases where gradient descent is preferable over an analytical solution. So first off, the analytical solutions, so least squares, or I forget the other really, really common one, it's blanking on it, they can have difficulty scaling to large, like when you have large feature spaces or a large amount of examples, because typically in the linear algebra case, you're solving a system of equations, and so for every feature you have a new equation. And so imagine that you're scaling to tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of parameters. That calculation can now get difficult. It can take some time. And stochastic gradient descent scales better to a larger number of features. It's not going to give you simplex. Yes, simplex is what I was thinking. Oh, thank you for that. So gradient descent, it's not always going to get you the best solution, but it can often very quickly give you a good enough solution. And in situations where you have a large amount of features, that can be preferable. The other reason that we go over gradient descent is more pragmatic, which is because neural nets is next. And backpropagation, the primary way that you train a neural net, is based on gradient descent. So I like for you to be exposed to this method in a relatively tame sense, because linear regression at the end of the day is relatively tame, before I throw you into the deep end of neural networks. So yeah, that's why we do it in this class, and why I think it's important to know how to do it in general. Excellent question. I do love getting that question. Couldn't one example's change in weights cancel out another's? Yes, it's possible. But you still have to acknowledge that the ordering could have an effect. Usually that effect is not going to be, with enough time, that effect will be minimized. But it is something to be aware of. Do things like p-values and such break down when you fit a linear regression model with stochastic gradient descent? No, they don't. But it depends what you're calculating the p-value for. So, for example, one one way to evaluate the quality of a regression model is to calculate correlation, and you can use correlation to calculate a p-value. Or to get a significance value. Like, you can still do that when it's fit using gradient descent. Like, you're still going to end up with the function of a line at the end of the day. So there's nothing that will stop you from being able to evaluate significance. Another way that you could evaluate it is just to look at the raw error value. So you could look at mean squared error and compare those across treatments. Then do something like a t-test because, hey, we have numeric loss values, and get a significance value that way. So no, it doesn't mess anything up doing things this way rather than a simplex or a least squares regression. Man, excellent questions. I love this. I love it when this is the way that class goes. So we did that. Here we are. So stochastic gradient descent, one example, then you update the weights, but the problem is here that your weights, not sporadically, they can erratically, their weights could update erratically. So when you're taking in a single example and using it to update your weights, the opposite could happen compared to a full batch update, which is that you could be pulled off in a bunch of weird directions by outliers. Unfortunate. But the benefit here is that you get so many weight updates per epoch. And now the middle ground. Mini batch. So with a mini batch, what you do is you just you average over a smaller number of examples before making your update. So average over smaller number of examples before updating. Weights. See, this is more practical, but is there a rule of thumb for choosing the number of features in relation to the number of examples you have? I can imagine a class where p is much greater than n, and you might have an overfitting issue. Yes, so that is true. As you add more features, the likelihood that you overfit is greater. And this is something that's especially important in linear regression because we'll learn about a way that you can artificially inflate the number of features that you have. So, the rule of thumb that I follow is that is one of exponentials. So remember, the curse of dimensionality says that as you add more features, you will need exponentially more data in order to fully fill out a model. And so, if I can choose the number of features, I'll try to do it based on that. If I want 10 features, I better have an exponentially more examples in order to support that model. You can't always do that because sometimes the data isn't there, or sometimes you can't control the number of features that you're dealing with. But if you can, then that's generally what I look for. So yeah, with a mini batch, what you do, and this is the most popular way of doing things currently, you would select a size of your mini batch, which is just how many examples do I want to see before I make a weight update. You could choose whatever you want. It's very problem dependent. Maybe in the programming assignment, you choose 10. What that means is that you would just go through your data set, your training set, 10 examples at a time. Calculate the gradients for each of those 10 examples, average over those 10 examples, and then do a weight update. So if you have 100 examples in the training set, and you have a mini batch size of 10, that means you would do 10 weight updates for an epoch. And this is kind of the best of both. It's a middle ground. So here, your weights might be might update erratically, but not as erratic as if you were to use stochastic gradient descent, but you are still losing some information because you're averaging over data, but you're not losing as much information as a full batch update. So yeah, this is a nice middle ground to choose. This is the middle ground approach. Put my phone far away from the microphone so people don't think they're getting texted. Okay, and so I wanted to go over this because this is something that you can choose what you want to use on the assignment. Do you want to use full batch update, stochastic gradient descent, or a mini batch? I use stochastic gradient descent, batch size of 1. But you don't have to. Cool. Alright. So the last thing that we went over last time was the role that alpha plays. And remember, the size of your alpha, like if you choose an alpha that's too large, you run the risk of divergence. And divergence is the phenomenon where, from time step to time step, you like overstep your weight update, and you end up increasing your error from the previous time step, and then you just spiral out of control as you consistently overcorrect just in the opposite direction. If the batch size is 10, then would you get num examples divided by 10 weight updates, right? Yes, that's right. Yeah. And usually you choose, like, at least when I choose a batch size, I like to do it such that it goes evenly into the size of my training set, so I don't have to worry about, like, rolling over back to the beginning of the training set. I like it to just be even, but yeah. That is right. So we talked about divergence and ways to prevent it. So one way is, well, choose a small or adaptive alpha. So the smaller alpha is, the less likely you are to diverge, but the longer it could take to you to converge. Which makes sense. Alpha controls how much your weights are going to update from time step to time step. If it's large, you're going to make large steps, and you'll probably converge faster, but you do run that risk of diverging. If they're small, you probably aren't going to diverge, but it's going to take you a lot longer to find your local or global minimum. Which is why some people choose to go with an adaptive alpha. Does the way you sample your batch sizes matter? Should we consider stratified sampling to keep class percentages relatively consistent during each epoch? So yes, in a purely, like, if you're doing things all the way you're supposed to, you should do that. You should make sure that your batches, like, the class distributions, or in this case, the class value distributions, kind of match that of the entire training set. However, in practice, a lot of times, we don't do that. We'll either just take things sequentially and divide it into batches, or you'll randomly assign things into batches and just call it a day. And it's usually just because the effect that you see on most of the data sets that we work with, the effect that you see from doing one of these other, like, batching methods compared to a more, rigorous sampling-based approach, is minimal. So, yeah. So in adaptive alpha, what happens here is you are constantly adjusting your alpha based on your error that comes out. So with an adaptive alpha, if your error increases from one time step to the next, reduce alpha. If error decreases, increase alpha. Simple. Simple, intuitive, effective. And this is not the only way you can do it. I've seen people in the past only decrease alpha. So if their error goes up, they say, oh, hey, I might diverge, lower alpha. Others will say, hey, I'm doing well now, let's increase alpha to try to increase the speed of things a bit. So if you wanted to use this for your programming assignment, that is perfectly fine. One of the most popular optimizers out there, the Atom optimizer, has an adaptive optimization thing built in. So this is a very, very like popular way to go about choosing alpha. Me, I don't know. I choose a constant alpha and stick with it. But that's me. You don't have to be like me. Okay. Another way to help prevent divergence. So alpha values is one way, but another is, remember when I said that the scale that your input is on might affect things. So when we were doing, for example, let's go back here. So my input here, size in feet, large values, 2,000, 1,000. And remember, because we're using mean squared error as our cost function, you have to multiply your not there. It's down here, actually. There it is, boom. You have to multiply your raw error by your input value. And so this could cause your numbers to just get very, very large. And so one way around this is to just like normalize, standardize, somehow pre-process your data. So you could, and this is no different than when we were talking about, what were we talking about? K-nearest neighbor, back when we were doing that. So you could, for example, say xi equals xi minus min x divided by max x minus min x. There we go. To squish things between 0 and 1. You could give the entire data set a mean of 0, standard deviation of 1, standardize it, minus, boop, sample mean over standard deviation, that is sigma x, so sample mean, standard deviation, and these are just ways of pre-processing your data, of getting it so that each of your features is on the same scale, and that can help prevent diverging because oftentimes it results in just smaller values. So a simple thing you can do that can help you out there. Would discriminative learning rates be useful here, where you pick a range of alpha since the learning rate, and slice the learning rate so that for training you could scale up or down the learning rate as you train? Yeah, that would be helpful here. Because a lot of times what you see, if you don't have like a bound on things, is that if you're, you're not diverging for a while, your alpha value goes up and up and up and up and up. And at some point, like, it gets too high, and then it has to go back down again, and then you just start kind of oscillating. Having a bound on things is a nice way to kind of guard against that. So that'd be good. Okay. So yeah, simple pre-processing stuff. Okay. Sorry, I feel like I'm going a little quickly here because I really want to get to this topic, multivariate. But still, if you have questions, I will answer them. Multivariate, yes. Regression. Ooh. Would the theta values have to be scaled up after the optimal regression formula is found? No. No, it would not. You would just need to make sure that whenever you passed in a new example, that you pre-processed that example so that it fit on the same scale as your training data. That's all. Yeah, I wouldn't mess with the weight values after you finished. But yeah, good. It is good that you think about that. It's good to, because yeah, you have to account for that. The weights that you learn will be for the input as it is scaled, as you pre-processed it. So you need to make sure to pre-process your test data the same way, the exact same way. Excellent.